Whether you call it ISO or ISO, we're going to talk about it right now, today. Hey everyone, welcome to the Visual Center. I'm Trent, and today I want to talk to you about ISO.
Excuse me?
Yes?
Yeah, okay.
It's pronounced ISO. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Today, I want to talk to you about ISO. ISO is one of the settings on a camera that you can change in order to improve your exposure. ISO can be a lifesaver when you need more light in order to create an image. Let's begin by clearing up a little misunderstanding. ISO is not an acronym. It is derived from the Greek word isos, which means equal. ISO is short form for the International Organization for Standardization. This is an independent organization which promotes worldwide industrial and commercial standards. And you can see here on its website a bit of the background regarding the origins of its name. So it's not pronounced ISO, it's pronounced ISO. Now, I'm not too picky how someone's going to pronounce ISO. In fact, I'll probably use both, because when I started in photography, I was taught that it's actually pronounced ISO. Let's move on. Photographic film, which is used in an analog camera like this SLR, is rated at various light sensitivities. These are called film speeds. These film speeds are differentiated by numerical values, such as this 100 speed film, or this 400 speed film. We have a box of 3200 speed film. Now, the smaller numerical values represent less sensitive film. The higher numerical values represent more sensitive film. So, low number is used in a bright situation where there's more light, and a large number is used in a darker situation where there's less light. So remember, low number for bright environments, like outdoors on a sunny day, and large numbers for dark environments, like indoors when there's little light. These film speeds migrated to digital. Similar to when a photographer uses film, someone using a digital camera adjusts the ISO setting based on the brightness of the scene they're photographing. ISO is similar to aperture and shutter speed numerical values because they are also often expressed in full stops. Now, this is a full stop ISO scale. Just like aperture and shutter speed, every ISO number I move up the scale represents double the sensitivity to light as the previous number. And every number I move down the scale represents half the sensitivity to light as the previous number. And again, similar to when aperture and shutter speed are adjusted on a digital camera, ISO scales are often represented in half stop or third stop scales. This is the full stop ISO scale. Next we have the condensed half stop ISO scale. And then lastly, the condensed third stop ISO scale. Digital cameras often come from a manufacturer set up to move in half stop or third stop ISO scales. These fractional movements can be very helpful. They help refine an exposure because every lighting situation is going to be different. A photographer can change the scale at which a camera moves. The option to utilize a half stop or full stop ISO scale can be found within a camera's menu. Now, this is the important part. This is how film ISO and digital ISO differ completely. Film light sensitivity, or ISO, is manipulated by adjusting the grain size or type of silver halide. Silver halide is what makes photographic film light sensitive. These variations create film which is more or less sensitive to light. This also leads to aesthetic differences, mainly differences in film grain. Now let me show you what I mean by film grain. This is an image I created while visiting New York City. I created this image on film. If I zoom into the bottom of the frame, you notice that there's a texture to the image. That is the film grain. Now, while in graduate school, I did some research on the structure of film. This picture of light, if I zoom into a part of transition on this image, you notice that there's a texture in the background. That is the film grain of the film. Now, part of this research also included the comparison of analog and digital images. This is a pixelated digital image, and this is a grainy analog image or film image. Now, regarding digital ISO, the image sensor of a camera is not exchanged for a more or less sensitive image sensor. The sensitivity of the image sensor in a digital camera remains the same. So what changes on a digital camera when you change the ISO? When a photographer captures a correctly exposed image, they are letting a specific amount of light into their camera and onto the image sensor. That amount of light was recorded by the image sensor. The image sensor outputs a specific electric signal for that amount of light. This signal can now be amplified, like turning up the volume on a radio, to brighten the image. This is how digital ISO works. Digital ISO is a gain or amplification of the signal from an image sensor. So, what does this mean for you and me? When I'm in a situation where I can't use a specific aperture or shutter speed I want because there isn't enough light, I can now adjust my ISO to compensate. And I'll be honest, ISO has been a real lifesaver in a lot of situations. So the important thing to remember is this. If my image is too dark and I don't want to change my aperture or shutter speed, I increase my ISO. Now let's get outside and start shooting, and I'll demonstrate what I mean. For this first demonstration, I'm actually going to stay indoors. I'm going to be photographing a child playing with blocks. Now the image is way too dark. You can see I've changed my aperture and now I'm changing my shutter speed. The image is still too dark. I don't want to change my shutter speed and aperture much more than that, so now I'm going to change my ISO. I need to make the image brighter, so I'm going to bring up my ISO. Bring it up to ISO 800. Now that looks like a much better exposed image. So here I'm going to start taking some photographs. I don't want to go slower than 1/100th of a second because I want to freeze the action. And I want a little bit of depth to the image. That's why I'm using an f4 for my aperture. Now I am going to increase the shutter speed a bit here. I'm going to change it to 1/200th of a second in order to freeze the action a bit more. Now I'm going to have to compensate by adjusting my ISO. I'm now going to bring up my ISO to 1600. And by adjusting the ISO, my exposure is back to where it was before. Okay, now we've moved outside. You can tell by using the same exposure data, the image is way too bright. There's way too much light. So I'm going to increase my shutter speed. I'm going to go all the way up to 1/8000th of a second. You can see it's still a little too bright. So now I'm going to change my ISO. It's too bright, so I need to bring my ISO down. ISO 800 looks about right. So now with my exposure dialed in, I can start shooting. Luckily I'm shooting at 1/8000th of a second. That should be fast enough to freeze the action. Taking a few more photos. That should be good. For this next demonstration, I'm going to be photographing an old medium format camera. This first set of images was created using window light. You can see the exposure is too dark, so I'm going to bring up my shutter speed. Now I'm on a tripod, so I can go to a much slower shutter speed. It's still too dark at 1/25th of a second, so I'm going to bring up my ISO to 800. I still think it's a little dark, so I'm going to adjust my shutter speed one more time to 1/10th of a second. That's my first photograph, and that exposure looks correct to me. So I'm going to shoot a few more images in order to get my final image. There's my final image. Now I'm actually going to close the curtains on the window and now use a studio strobe to get a little bit more dramatic lighting. This is the modeling light of the strobe being turned on. I'm going to use the same exposure that I used for my natural light image. And here's the first photograph. And it's way overexposed. There's too much light. So I'm going to adjust my ISO and bring it down. Because I'm using a strobe, my shutter speed is not going to do much. Here's the second image, and it's still a little too bright. So I'm going to bring my ISO all the way back down to 100 ISO. And hopefully that'll give me a better exposed image. Now that's the image. I think that looks much better. So with my exposure dialed in, I'm going to start photographing to get my final image. Hopefully those demonstrations help you understand how to use ISO. Again, it can be a real lifesaver when there's not enough light. But there is one major drawback I haven't mentioned yet. When using a higher ISO, you introduce digital noise into your images. The higher the ISO number, the greater the amount of digital noise in an image. So what is digital noise? This is what it looks like. This is an image I took a few years ago while up in the mountains. If I zoom in on the area of stars, you can see that in the black parts of the sky, there's a bit of discoloration, maybe a bit red or green. Now here's a second image. I don't like this image as much, but I think it's easier to see the noise. If I zoom in on the stars, again, you can see that in the black parts of the sky, there is some red, green, maybe even blue discoloration. This is one component of digital noise. When I bought my first digital camera, I wasn't able to shoot above 400 ISO. The noise was too distracting. But with more modern cameras, I find myself using higher ISOs, 800, 1600, even 3200, without seeing much noise or at least acceptable amounts of noise. Camera manufacturers keep improving the noise produced by higher ISOs. Now, surprisingly, digital noise can be a very divisive topic, so I'm genuinely interested. How do you feel about digital noise? Does noise bother you? Let me know in the comments below if you've ever found digital noise to be distracting in an image. And I'll give you a little extra tip as well. Oftentimes, noise can be less distracting if a noisy image is converted to black and white. It's a little trick I've seen other photographers use, and I've even used a few times throughout my career. Okay, so how do I use ISO? Whenever I'm shooting digitally, I always begin with my ISO set to its lowest native setting. Depending on the camera I'm using, it's usually around ISO 100. I first set my desired aperture or shutter speed depending on what I want to emphasize with my image, and then I determine if there's enough light for my image. If there's not enough light, I then increase my ISO in order to create a better exposure. I'll be demonstrating how to get a properly exposed image in my next video, so be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon for future video notifications so you don't miss it. So whether you call it ISO or ISO, it's an incredibly helpful setting to learn how to use on your camera. Now, if you have any questions regarding ISO or digital noise, be sure to comment below and I'll do my best to answer them. Be sure to also check out our recently launched Patreon page. You can find a link to it below in the description for this video. If you have any ideas or requests about benefits you would like to have after becoming a patron, be sure to let us know, because here at the Visual Center, we would love to engage with you and help you as much as we can. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Today we're going to talk about ISO and ISO.